Well, good evening, everyone. I found out that when you write a book called Life After Doom, the word doom sucks all the air out of the room. And people don't notice the life after that comes before it, right? It's been interesting. The book came out last May. I've written over 20 books, so I've been at this for a while. But this is a book that I cared about. I've cared about all my books, but it was one that I felt especially urgent about, and I felt I was doing something in this book that was difficult. Do any of you know who Rainn Wilson is? Did you watch The Office, Dwight Schrute? So Rainn has a podcast and asked me to be on the podcast, and he read a couple of my books before the podcast, and he just said, I don't know why you decided to write this book. I think he felt you're trying to tell people something that they probably would rather not know, But I was a pastor for 24 years. I was used to telling people things they didn't want to know. But here's what I found out since the book came out. For people under a certain age, somewhere 40, 45, it's almost like somebody handed them out a script, because the word that I hear again and again is relief. And when people are older than that age read the book, the word I always hear is hard. And I think there are reasons for those two responses. The younger people say relief because the things I talk about in the book are things that they have felt since they were kids. Things that were obvious to them, and they didn't understand why nobody talked about it. I remember a woman who spent her entire career as a pretty high-up person in the Environmental Protection Agency, read the book and contacted me, and she said, "You said the quiet part out loud." So for younger people, it was relief, but for older people, it was hard because we have been raised in a world where every problem is solvable. With a little money, little technology, in religious settings, a little prayer, we would be able to solve every problem. And we happen to be born at a time with fossil fuels that we could solve just about every problem. They made things easy for us. They made us be able to literally... You remember how Jesus said, with faith you can move mountains? With fossil fuels you can move mountains. Just buy a couple bulldozers and they're gone. So a lot of us have spent our whole lives in a time when our solutions always felt bigger than our problems. But when I use the word doom, I don't mean the end of the world. I don't mean the end of the space-time universe. I don't mean automatic extinction. But what I mean is a feeling that comes through your body. Maybe some of us in the room have been in a doctor's office when he says, I've got some bad news for you. And you know that feeling kind of starts at your head and goes down to your toes. Or you maybe have had another person come and say something to you that you knew, as of this moment, my life is going to be different. What happens when people have this feeling that our problems have grown bigger than our solutions, and for the first time in our lives, we find ourselves saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to make of this. Look, I'm 68. I know I don't look a day over 78. I never in my life thought I would see what I saw in August of 2017, when a young couple who I'd introduced to each other, young clergy couple, or they were clergy people, they met and they fell in love and got married. And so I had a sort of special, they had a special place in my heart and vice versa. And they were pastors in Charlottesville, Virginia. And they called me in July and they said, you may not have heard, but we've been having all these Ku Klux Klan rallies here in Charlottesville, and there's a group of people planning a civil war, and they want Charlottesville to be the capital of the new Confederacy. So they're going to have this big rally on, August 10th and 11th, and we're organizing the clergy of Charlottesville to stand up to these people and say, you're coming here with a white supremacist, Nazi, neo-Nazi set of policies and values, and we're standing up and say, that's not what we're about in Charlottesville. And they said, we especially feel this because there's a large Jewish community, and a lot of these are very committed neo-Nazis, and we Christians want to stand up with our Jewish friends and Muslim friends, and together we want to give a message. That's not what we're about. And they said, we're getting a lot of women clergy to show up, and we're getting a lot of rabbis and imams to show up. We're getting a lot of clergy of color to show up. We're really having a hard time getting white male Christian clergy to come. And we thought of you. They said, you're white and you're male. We thought of you. They said, look, it's going to be dangerous. There are going to be a lot of guns here that weekend. And we have been told that there's a good possibility for violence. But we're wondering, could you come? We're just looking for people to stand with us. And so my big decision then was whether I told my wife everything they told me or not. So she told me it was okay if I went as long as I didn't get killed. If you get killed, I'll kill you. No, she didn't say that exactly. But I was in Charlottesville, and I watched people. I never dreamed in my life I'd watch people marching down a street with Nazi slogans, with Nazi flags. I was just up the hill when a young woman named Heather Heyer was killed when a guy drove his car through a crowd. And people, and that day I had, clergy collar and a stole on because they wanted all of us to be in kind of clergy regalia so that our presence would be visible. And I remember the sound of somebody running up the street with leather shoes flapping on the ground. And he ran up to me and another pastor, and he said, we need you guys down here. All hell broke loose down the corner. And so then our feet are slapping on the ground, and we ran down. And we were there before the first responders were there. People were lying on the ground. I was with one woman whose sister had been hit, and the sister's son had been lost in the crowd, and I was trying to help her, and we were praying with people, and it was chaos. And I just remember thinking, the world is changing. And look, we're in a situation now where a lot of us never thought we would be in, with people making Nazi salutes and then telling us that's not what it was, which is sort of a double Nazi thing to do. Tell you, do something, and then tell you not to believe your own eyes, believe them. Man, that's sick. But we're in a time when suddenly the title, Life After Doom, a bunch of people who've read the book called me and said, why did you do that, In other words, now it feels like maybe we're understanding what you were talking about. This book really elicited in me a memory from when I was, 8 or 9 years old. I was born in upstate New York, where I remember my first experience of trick-or-treating was with snow falling, right? It was in the snow belt from both Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And my family, my mom and dad, decided every February they'd had enough winter, so they would drive down to Florida, and we'd spend a week in Florida just to get some sunshine and warm air. People here, you wouldn't understand that, but maybe that's why some of you moved here, because you lived in some of those places. And one year, my grandpa and grandma came, and Grandpa Smith was like my favorite person in the world. He had a full set of false teeth, which he would take out and do amazing things with, I just thought he was the funnest grown-up that I knew. And we were driving in Central Florida, and I'm sitting at the window, and Grandpa and Grandma are trying to control my brother and me. He was probably at the other side so we wouldn't fight. That thing, they have to separate us. And I'm looking out the window, and for the first time in my life, I saw some pump jacks, those things that pump oil out of the ground. They look kind of like a sandpiper pecking on the ground. And I'd never seen one. I said, Grandpa, what's that? And he said, it's called a pump jack. That's where we get the gasoline that runs our car. And I'm thinking, there's a lot of cars in the world. and there's a lot of gasoline in the world. And if you suck it all out, and that's what's inside the earth's going to kind of shrink like a collapsing soda can, you know. I said, Grandpa, what happens when they suck it all out? And he said, my grandfather was like the most sincere, loving, good-humored, wonderful, very, very conservative Christian you could ever meet. So when I said, what'll happen when we pump it all out? I'm sure that thought had never crossed his mind. And so he said, oh, that'll never happen, Brian. God put enough oil to last us till the end of time when Christ returns. And I remember thinking, I love you, Grandpa, but I don't buy that. But I looking back, and I remember that because it was maybe the first time when someone I loved so much I thought was wrong. And I wasn't sure why. But that stayed with me, and I look back on that moment, and I realized my grandfather was born in 1893. And he never had a passport. And the only times he left New York State was when he'd come with us to Florida. And one other time he made a trip to Arizona for some reason. And I don't think he ever left the state of New York other than those times. And for him, the world was so big. It was almost infinite. And he couldn't imagine us running out of something. And his theology and his sense of the world. And here I was, a little boy. But right around that time was when we first had men go up into space and take pictures of the earth from space. I think it was a year or two after that people landed on the moon and took pictures of the earth from the moon. But in my mind, do you all remember Life magazine? I had a Life magazine cover in my mind of the earth as this little blue dot in space. And to me, the earth was a limited thing. And I realize now, I grew up in a different world than my grandfather. And people in this room, we probably live in different worlds in some sense. Our understanding of what's going on in the world can be so different. And I think what's happened to us in recent years is that many of us who grew up with one understanding of how the world works have been going through a process of disillusionment. Now that sounds like a bad thing. Disillusionment. It's scary. It's unhappy. But look, are you better off without illusions or with them, right? If you're interested in actually being in touch with reality, the loss of illusions is a good thing. And people who study how this sort of thing happens often use what some people call a U-shaped process, what some people call a path of descent, a path of losing illusions in 4 phases. First, a letting go phase, where we start to think, my way of seeing the world might not be right. They might be right, I might be wrong. Or, my view of the world doesn't explain what's happening right now. And then we get to a letting be phase. If we persist, sometimes we just run back up the hill and decide, I prefer my old illusions, right? That's called denial. But when we go down to the letting be, for the first time in our lives, very often, we say, I don't know what to do. Grace and I just met up with some friends who we hadn't seen for 20 years yesterday. And in these 20 years, we've all been through a lot. And they've been through some real rough times with one of their kids, who we just knew as a little guy. And now he's an adult. And they talked to us about what they went through. And my friend, he said to me, I got a lot of scars. And of course, when his son started to get in trouble, he tried to crack down and get control. And he realized that the more he did that, the more he drove his son away. Some of us have been through that as parents. And he reached a point where he said, I don't know what to do. When you reach that point of, I don't know what to do, that's the letting be phase, where you just say, something's going to happen and I don't control it. And then there comes a letting come phase, because when for the first time we admit we don't know, it's almost like we take a bunch of stuff out of our brain and make room for some new ideas. We've let go of some illusions. Now there's room for something new. We can imagine new possibilities. And then we're set free to give life another try with a new set of possibilities and with a few less illusions. And I think something like that is going on in our world today. There we go. So I structured the book, Life After Doom, around this 4-phase process. Letting go, dropping our defenses against a reality we didn't ask for. And I am having a hard time with my clicker here. I'm not, so if we, hey, actually, Grace, could you help me out and go back to my computer? Or actually, my friend back there is going to help me. There we go. It just worked, so something happened. So I'm defining doom as the feeling that comes when we realize our problems have become bigger than our solutions, what psychologists describe as fright without escape. And we're facing this on many different levels. In the book, I call it a kind of pre-traumatic stress disorder that arises when our old normal is deteriorating and no new normal has come into view. It isn't a single catastrophic event at some point in the future. It's an emotional and intellectual experience when we realize that we're in trouble. We're in uncharted territory, politically, economically, ecologically, and militarily, and in many other ways. And a lot of experts who study this sort of thing over the last few years have been trying to find a new word to describe the trouble we're in. And often, many of them speak of a meta-crisis or a polycrisis. And what they mean by this is we have a combination of problems. Each problem makes the other problems harder to solve. And so one of our problems is, how do we live with the planet? And climate change is an obvious, maybe the most obvious global example of this now. But climate change is a symptom of a deeper problem that scientists call overshoot. Overshoot, very simple idea. If you understand this idea, this will help you for the rest of your life to understand what's going on. Simple idea. It means we suck out from the earth more resources than the earth can replenish. And we pump into the earth more wastes than the earth can detoxify. Simple idea. Suck out more than it can replenish, pump out more than it can detoxify. And when that happens, it means that every generation, the children inherit a poorer earth than the ones their parents inherited. And what's happened in the lifetime of all of us in the room is the speed of impoverishment of the earth has increased every generation. I was meeting some folks when we had lunch this afternoon, and I was hearing how much Encinitas has changed in the last 20 years. Now look, there's more wealth here than there was 20 years ago. More buildings, more banks, more, restaurants. In one sense, there's more wealth. But think of the earth itself. It's covered with a lot more cement, right? And this is happening around the world, to our oceans, to our soil, to our air, to our climate, to the number of fish out there, to the number of wild animals. If you were to guess, think of all the wild animal, think of all the animal life in the world. Let's think of mammals. All of the mammals in the world. What percent of those mammals do you think are wild, and what percent are domesticated? So what we've done is we've taken billions and billions of elk and deer and elephants and giraffes, and we replace them with cattle and pigs and goats and sheep. So now something like 91% of the mammals in the world are domesticated mammals, and that's fewer of all wild animals. Think of the number of birds in the world. How many of them are chickens? This is one of those things when I tell you people will be happy, you'll be happy on one level, but think about it, and then you'll realize not to be happy about it. But when you were kids, if you took a drive in the country, there was a good chance your windshield would get covered with bugs. There aren't many places anymore where your windshield gets covered with bugs. Because depending on where we are in the earth, there's anywhere from a 50 to an over 90% loss of insect biomass. And 30% of the calories you eat are because of insect pollinators. There's fewer of them, much fewer of them. Fewer insects means fewer birds and fewer other creatures that feed on insects. All of that relates to the planet. How do we seek peace with other people? We all lived in an age after the World War II when there was a new world order that was built that was based on American strength. People could trust Americans. We did some terrible things in the last 100 years, but people could trust us that we would try to keep the order intact. We never went to war and then demanded the mineral wealth of the country, and as sort of a blackmail. We'll help you for a price, because it was just not the way that the world was working. But now we reach a place where it looks like the way that people want to keep peace is through hostility and domination and violence. So that you get the idea that people think if we just had more weapons, we'd all be more safe. And if we had more powerful weapons that could kill more people with the pressing of one button. How do we distribute power? We've been working on this idea of democracy. Let's get the power out of the hands of kings and the ultra-rich, and let's try to let everybody have more opportunity. Have you noticed that the rich have been making quite a comeback lately? How do we define profit? We used to believe, hundreds of years ago, we believed that profit was something called a commonwealth. That when all of us are doing better, each of us are doing better. But we've shifted to a world where wealth is what I have, what I can hoard and control. And then how do we shape purpose and meaning in our lives? And we used to find that help from our religions. But fewer and fewer people are finding that same help from their religious communities. And it's not just the Christian faith. All organized religion is experiencing a similar deterioration of support, a feeling that my religion isn't giving me meaning and purpose in my life anymore, the way it must have for my grandparents. It used to be the Christian religion had about 33% of the world's population. Islam had about 24% of the world's population. Hinduism had about 17 or 18% of the world's population. Hinduism already got knocked out from the third largest religion to the fourth because the non-religious now are the third largest religious group. And most of them are made up of people who used to be Christian or Muslim. And so when you look at these different problems, each one of them makes the others harder to solve. Now, what sometimes you hear people say is that we humans have an ecological problem. We have a problem with the climate. We have a problem with the earth. And then other people say, no, the earth has a human problem. I was reading about someone giving a talk like this, and someone said, if we burn all of the oil that's in the earth, we will raise the temperature of the earth over 6 degrees centigrade. You can do the math. That's, 10 plus degrees Celsius, which would likely lead to the extinction of the human species. And someone yelled out, "Good riddance." And everybody laughed. But this idea that human beings are the problem, I don't think that's accurate, totally accurate. There's some truth to it. But I think the truth is the way human beings are organizing our lives together in our current civilization. We human beings could exist in a lot of different ways. We have this thing called neuroplasticity. It's why we became the dominant species on the earth. People, when they quote Charles Darwin, most of them have been misled about what Charles Darwin really taught. He didn't teach survival of the fittest, meaning the strongest, most aggressive, most competitive. Fittest in the 1860s meant those that fit best. Survival of the fittest meant survival of the most adaptable, those that can adapt to their current reality. And so we humans are very adaptable, but we have locked ourselves into a certain arrangement of our current civilization. And our current civilization will destroy the earth. Those of you who were in church this morning, I quoted a brilliant Catholic theologian and thinker of the 20th century named Father Thomas Berry. And I'll just repeat what I said this morning. Thomas Berry defined our crisis with 3 sentences. First, the glory of the human is becoming the desolation of the earth. Our glorious civilization is creating overshoot. The earth cannot sustain it. The desolation of the earth is becoming the destiny of the human. You can't eat money. When you destroy the earth, it will destroy that species that destroys the earth. And third, every human activity must from now on be judged by the degree to which it contributes to a new human-earth relationship. And my real purpose for writing this book and for being here is to say, in this group of people, tonight, we could take some steps forward in helping us imagine the necessity of a new human-earth relationship, that we look at the earth in a different way, not just as a source of profit for billionaires, not just as a source of gross domestic product for nations, not just valued by its worth in money, but to understand that money derives its value from 2 things: from the inherent wealth of the earth and from the created wealth of people's labor. So without earth, you don't have people and you don't have labor and you don't have anything. And so for us to start to imagine a new human-earth relationship is really what this is about. And when we're worried about the future of the earth, we have to realize the earth is way more resilient than human civilization. And so what seems to us like this unshakable system that we've created, we find out it actually could be very fragile. Tell me if you'd agree with this statement. Every civilization of the past failed. Every civilization of the past collapsed. And most of us have lived our lives thinking that ours will be the first exception. So if we start to say, well, maybe this is how we collapse. And so in writing the book, you might have never known this, but there was actually a field called collapsology of sociologists, historians, economists, anthropologists who study how civilizations fail. And I'm not going to go into that tonight. I talk about that some in the book. Let's see. There we go. But there's a set of patterns that they notice in how civilizations fail. Civilizations grow, their growth creates problems. They solve those problems, the civilization grows more. Some problems end up costing more to solve than the civilization can afford, and some problems become unsolvable at any price. The problems may be internal division, political division, civil war and civil violence, discouragement, exhaustion, internal problems. They could be external. An enemy comes and attacks the civilization and it's destroyed. But when a civilization can no longer solve the problems it faces, it stops growing and then becomes vulnerable to collapse. And the collapse happens sometimes suddenly, but very often in a stair-step fashion. It decreases in cohesion, in wealth, in power, in complexity, and ultimately in population. And that kind of collapse for the Roman Empire took a couple of centuries. went down a flight of stairs, got back on its feet, fell down another flight of stairs. And some happened very suddenly. But this is a reality that many of us have thought we would never have to think about. If it ever happened, it would be in some science fiction future. And so one of the things I tried to do in the book is say, we better start thinking about this. And I tried to synthesize all the research I'd done in 4 basic scenarios. And in the year or so since the book has been out, everybody said, yeah, this is a good way to describe it. First, collapse avoidance. We could be in a nosedive, and soon enough, we pull out of the nosedive, and we learn what we need to learn and change what we need to change so that we can have another run at civilization. We might not do that. And then we might have a collapse where we actually have a crash. And then we pick up the pieces. And in the process of picking up the pieces, we learn a new relationship with the earth, a new relationship with each other, new relationships maybe even with ourselves, and we might say also with God. And there could be some kind of rebirth. Or collapse survival. There'll be a collapse, but the collapse will be so total that what happens on the other side will not be recognizable to us as a civilization. It will be some form of survival, but it won't look like a civilized survival. And then fourth is collapse extinction. And we really could create the conditions. Imagine if things get bad and people start fighting, and then somebody presses a nuclear bomb button, and 48 seconds later, somebody else presses a nuclear bomb button, and all the bombs are in the air, and none of us want to think about what that looks like, and we pray that won't happen. Let's see, there we go. And what this does, and might be doing this to you right now, but it creates incredible stress in our bodies. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is to say, look, every human being who starts on this path of descent and they lose some illusions is going to have to manage some real stress and tension in our own nervous system. And you've probably heard the old idea that we have 3 levels of a brain: a reptilian brain, a mammalian brain, and then a primate or human brain. And that's biologically a sound idea. It's been a bit discredited because people oversimplify it. And also we have a problem because a lot of people don't like reptiles. So they make it sound like that part of the brain is bad. But I think the truth is that basic brain, I call it the survival committee of our internal board of directors. And that survival committee is not primitive. It's the most highly devolved part of our bodies. It's the part that got developed through the fish and the amphibians and the reptiles and the dinosaurs all the way up to us. It's been around a long time. It works so fast, you don't have to think about it. And that's what keeps us going. When I walk, I don't have to say, okay, left foot, lift, move, right foot, your turn. Come on, you can do it. I don't have to think about it. My body just does it. I don't have to say, oh, shoot, I forgot to breathe. I'm about to pass out. My body, not only that, but if you come running at me with a knife, my body is ready to fight, right? We talk about the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. There's one more, let's call it reproduce, that are those base. We don't exist if we don't have those responses, that element. So I'm a huge fan of reptiles and what they gave us, you know. And then comes the mammal brain. This is the brain, the development that happens in our history when creatures start incubating their eggs inside the mother's body. And then when the baby's born, the baby goes to a breast and receives milk, actual nourishment from the mother's body. And that requires this deep bond between mother and baby, and father and mother and baby, and father and mother and baby, and the other siblings, and the aunts and uncles, and the cousins, and the grandpas and grandmas. And all of that helps us be herd creatures, where we belong to groups. By the way, it's one of the reasons why Churches are so important because it's a place for us to be in a herd of fellow humans where we get to know each other and take care of each other. It's really the way we always used to live as hunter-gatherers, dependent on each other, belonging, knowing that we really belong somewhere. And then we have this meaning committee that helps us understand and think about what's happening and ask questions about the meaning of our life and the meaning of our actions, have foresight about the future, have hindsight about the past, have insight into this moment. And when you put all those three together, they're constantly working together and constantly getting into arguments. This is why you're tired every night, because your committees have been having big arguments with each other. And everything I told you tonight set up some stress among those committees. The survival committee, when I started saying these things about a possibility of collapse, it was going, don't believe this crap. That's impossible. That'll never happen. Because that part of your being is thinking, if that were to happen, I'd have to do something about it. It's my job to keep this organization safe. Or maybe that part's saying, hey, you better pay attention to this. But the belonging committee is saying, you know, my family and friends don't really believe any of this stuff. If I were to believe this, I'd be in trouble with them. I don't want to think about it. The survival committee says, you better think about it. If there's any truth to it, it's dangerous. Some tension. Meaning committee's watching this thinking, who do I side with? The survival committee or the belonging committee? And there's all kinds of arguments. And listen, I think hundreds of millions of people around the planet have already engaged their nervous system in this work of facing the reality of our current situation. And I'm going to guess none of you would have come tonight if you weren't open. You either had started that process or you're open to start the process. But there are, 7+ billion people who haven't even begun this process yet. By the way, the percentage of people who have begun this process is much bigger outside the United States than inside. I'll leave you to think about why that might be. But around the world, you may have heard this. There's this big thing happening of young people saying, we don't want to have children because we kind of see where this thing is going. There's this huge thing in the mental health field called climate psychology, where climate change is affecting people's psychology in such a deep degree. It's creating this, some people are calling it the second pandemic or the new pandemic of stress as people's nervous systems go through this. And let me just say, we're in a church. I was a pastor for 24 years. I think the Christian tradition has incredible resources to help people. It's just that most of us don't know what those resources are. Because we ended up in a religious setting where we've forgotten our treasures that are buried out in the field behind the house. Treasures like contemplation. We have prayer, but for a lot of us, prayer is just making a list of our complaints, or our Christmas list, or our wish list. But, for ancient people, prayer was a matter of survival, and it was the way that they learned, in a sense, to bring inner calm and inner harmony, to let themselves face their fears without being freaked out by them. It gave them fright with a way of integrating that and escaping the domination of fear. Incredible resources. Even the resource of gathering once a week or more to get our bodies together in the same place and sing together. Literally get our vocal cords vibrating, our lungs and sinuses resonating, getting our lips moving together, our bodies maybe swaying together in the rhythm. Get the whole herd saying, it's a hard world out there. We're facing some tough stuff, but we can count on each other. We're in harmony here. I mean, incredible practices that help us in this very essential process. And one more thing I want to share before we take a break and open up for questions. When we face in a time of unraveling the possibilities that come when we let go and let be and let come, we start to get dreams of what a new future could be like on the other side of the collapse of whatever system we're part of. And it's very interesting. Most of us weren't taught to read the Bible this way, but I actually am becoming convinced after all these years, this is one of the main gifts of the Bible. You've all heard of the prophets, and many of us were taught in a very immature, shallow way that what prophets were about was to foretell the future, especially to foretell the future that said that our religion was the only right religion and all others were false. Can I just tell you, that's propaganda. That's not good theology. It's not even good literacy of the Bible. The prophets were people who lived in times when their current way of life, their current civilization was in the process of collapsing. And what the prophets begin by doing is warning people. If you keep going like this whole thing's going to fall apart. You stop caring about the poor, there's going to be so much social unrest that will collapse. You better start caring about the poor. You're worshiping the gods of other nations, you're losing what makes our people unique. That's their way of assimilating you. Get you to worship their gods. It'll be easy for them to assimilate you into their empire. But when the collapse happens, that's when the prophets, for the first time, see new possibilities. Isaiah, great example. Isaiah has been warning people for decades. Things are getting worse. Things are getting worse. You better change your ways. You better stop this nosedive. And the people don't listen. And after the collapse, instead of saying, I told you so, he says, okay, the thing has fallen apart. Let's start imagining a world where we beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. Let's imagine a world where we become less interested in warfare and more interested in making the earth green again. There's so many examples. And that's what I hope all of us can be part of. If we go through the process of letting go and letting be, that new visions of what life can be on the other side of the difficulties that none of us chose and none of us wanted, what new possibilities could emerge? That's a good place for us to stop and take a breath. And could I invite us to just have maybe a few moments in silence to let those thoughts settle? And I'd love you to see what's arising in you. A feeling, a question, a thought. And we'll just take 30 seconds now in silence together, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So we'll go around with the mic. I just want to promise you, if you're having trouble landing your question, I promise I will interrupt you and help you land it, okay? So don't be shy, and whoever would like to be first. And as soon as you raise your hand, we've got a question in the back. As soon as you ask your question, if you have the next question, raise your hand and get the attention of one of the people with the mic, and that way we can just keep it going. And would you say your name, please?
My name is Vanessa.
Hi, Vanessa.
So I just, I get the part about, collapse, and it's hard to think of the future and dream, and I probably won't be around for after the collapse, but I wonder, what can I do to prepare those who will be around after?
What a beautiful question. Thanks, Vanessa. So let me first say, when I talk about those 4 scenarios, the first scenario is collapse avoidance, and we may be able to avoid collapse this time around. Later in the book, I say that could be a good thing, it might not be a good thing. Because if we were to avoid collapse now in a way that let us keep committing overshoot, 100, 200, 400 years from now, the earth would be so much poorer when the collapse happened that, it would be nice if we learned our lessons sooner. But your question, Vanessa, is a beautiful and generous question. And can I tell you, I'm not just trying to flatter you, but because I think a lot of people felt this, but there are a lot of people who don't have the same heart that you have to ask the question that way. There's a lot of people, maybe part of all of us, that says, I won't be around, thank God. Tough to be you young people, But your attitude was, with the time I have, I want to try to make a difference. And the first thing I'd say is, anyone who has that attitude, you can't help but make a difference just by your presence and your spirit and caring. Just think about this. In this country, if people over the age of 50 said, for the rest of my life, I'm not going to vote for my own economic and personal interests. I'm going to vote on what's best for my children and grandchildren. Things would be very different. Maybe that idea could spread enough in the next 4 years that maybe the next time, older people vote disproportionately. And maybe older people would now then start having conversations with their children and grandchildren and saying, what are the issues that really concern you? And maybe people who are rich and well off would start saying, I wonder what are the issues that hurt people who are not so well off. And I wonder what people would start doing if, instead of just thinking, what are our human interests, thought, the world, I'm not a big fan of mosquitoes, but those insects are pretty important. Who cares about the balance of nature? And how can I start voting? So the way we vote changes when we have concern that you illustrated in your question. Let me say one other thing about that, and there's so much more, but I want to be sure we have time for some other questions. A lot of us, when we learn about this, we think, what can I do? And I want to tell you 2 things that will sound contradictory, but I'm giving you an intentional paradox. The first answer is, there's nothing you can do alone as one person. My friend Bill McKibben says, when people ask me, what can I do as an individual? He says, stop thinking about you as an individual. And start thinking about you joining with other people and building shared people power. For all of us who are over 60, my friend Bill McKibben started something called Third Act. And it's a way of inviting people over 60 to start acting for the good of the planet and the good of the poor and for the future of peace. And he's helping older people with a lot of time on their hands and some with money on their hands to become activists. I think it's a brilliant thing. But when we stop thinking like individuals, then we start thinking, how can we build groups that begin dreaming together and working together and thinking together? So that's the first thing. Whatever you do, do it with others and do it as part of organizing movements. And I suspect that in the coming years, we're going to see a rise of new movements with fresh thinking. We're also going to see a rise of suppression of those movements. And I think that's going to be part of the drama of the next few years. And a lot of people will be frightened, but I think when we really start to care and we go through that process, I think we'll be emboldened. And then the only other thing I would say is that, so what I do as an individual is much less important than what I can get other people to do. And then the second thing I'd say is what my friend Catherine Hayhoe says, committed Christian leader who's also a leading climate scientist. And Catherine says the single most important thing any of us can do about climate, the environment, and the situation of our world in general is to talk about it. Because that gets other people involved. And I'll give you all a little script that could help you. Here's the script. Hey, how are you doing? Here's what you say. Do you really want to know? Yeah, I want to know. I don't think we have time for it right now. You really want to know? I'll tell you. And then say, well, no, I want to know. We have time. Let's talk. You say, I'm worried. I'm brokenhearted. Use a word that describes your emotion, because we don't need arguments about politics and policies. Everybody, that turns into an ego versus ego clash, and it just produces noise and anger, and people tending to dig in their heels. But when we go with emotion, I'm worried, I'm heartbroken, I'm concerned for my grandchildren, and then see where it goes. But when you start on that human level, I think it makes things possible. So thanks for that question. Here we go. Yes.
Hi. Over the past, my name's Melissa, by the way.
Melissa?
Melissa, yes.
Thanks, Melissa.
Over the past 5 years or so, I've been going through, deconstructing, disillusionment of my faith, and just learning a lot. And what you're talking about, and something that I've been struggling with and would love your wisdom, is how to pull out the character of God and separate it from the indoctrination I received in the evangelical church.
Yes.
And still understanding who he is in light of what's been happening.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So important. So important. So I'm not, this isn't like a test, but were you in church this morning? Okay. So no shame on that. But in the service, I started with a little joke. And it's appropriate here. It's not a funny joke, so get your hopes down. But I said there are two kinds of people. People who divide the world into two kinds of people and people who don't. But that was the joke. But that was the setup to say there are two kinds of people in the world. There are indigenous people and there are colonizing people. Indigenous people fundamentally believe that they belong to the earth. Colonizing people fundamentally believe the earth belongs to them. And I think many of us in this room grew up in a colonizing civilization. And if we trace our ancestry back, we have generations of colonizers. And interestingly, the Christian religion started as an indigenous religion. But it was picked up by colonizers, and the colonizers developed the theologies that have taught many of us what we think Christianity is. And I think one of our challenges is, for when you say deconstruct, in some ways deconstructing is decolonizing. It's trying to say, how has Christianity been twisted by the colonizers, and how can I rediscover it as a part of my return to try to re-indigenize and becoming a child of the earth once again. Which, by the way, if that sounds a little new agey or whatever, in the Genesis story, you remember the story of God creates the heavens and the earth? When God creates human beings, God creates Adam. Adam in Hebrew means the child of red earth, child of the earth. And we're rediscovering our identity in an indigenous way with the God of the earth. Not the God of empires, but the God of birds and trees and rivers and glaciers and stars and galaxies, and reconnecting with that understanding of God. And we Christians think Jesus did an amazing job of embodying the values and spirit of that God, not the God of the empire, but that God. And I think one of our challenges right now is there are parts of Christianity that they're called Christianity, but they're really colonizer Christianity. And there are other forms of Christianity that are trying to get to that more earthy, incarnational, if I can use a big word, Christianity, that we're going to. So I hope that will help you. It changes everything. It really changes everything. And I I'm not trying to sell a book, but one of the things in this book that I try to do is give an overview of the whole Bible in one chapter from an indigenous, to reading the Bible as indigenous literature, and then rediscovering Jesus in that context. So I think that will help you. I hope it will. Thanks for that question. And we've got one here. And okay, we'll go right here. We're coming. Got the mic coming.
After listening to you talk, I was thinking that I could jackhammer up my driveway so my front yard could breathe better. But I'm just thinking that's not even a drop in the bucket. That's just one driveway. But do you think other people would let their yards breathe better?
That last sentence, do I think?
Do you think if I did something like that, it would catch on with? Is there anything? I don't know.
Your first name again? Jennifer. I love you, Jennifer. That's great. That's so great. For those again here, Jennifer said, maybe I could jackhammer up my driveway. Well, look, if you feel like doing that, go for it. Because, when we talk about letting go and letting be, if that's one of the things that comes for you, let it come. It won't fix everything. But two things it will do. I'll save the more important one for a second. But the first thing it will do is it will give an example to everybody around you of somebody who cared enough to do something. Do you all know that, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you are doing this, but there's a thing around North America that's happening of this group of people who understand that monarch butterflies are going extinct, and there are people who are figuring out how to grow milkweed and other plants in their garden to bring back monarch butterflies. And so people build butterfly gardens. And people understand bats are going extinct, in part because insects are going extinct, and they're building bat houses. And there are people who are doing amazing things, and other people hear about it, and they just think, that's pretty cool. You're doing that. And you might be the first person they've ever met who is trying to model a new human-earth relationship. And that is a beautiful thing. That's a really important thing. Even more important, I think, is that if you were to do nothing, something in you would be harmed. And sometimes maybe we need to think of those things we do, whether it's getting rid of a cement driveway and having another kind of, whatever it is. If we think of them as our works of art, our beautiful things that we get to do, it expresses who we are, and that helps us stay alive. So thanks for that question. It's a beautiful question. Beautiful things. As I say that, I remember a story that's going to come up in the season of Lent. Almost every year we hear this story about the woman who washed Jesus' feet with ointment and perfume right before he was killed. And do you remember Judas got upset and said, all that money was wasted. We could have sold that perfume for money and given it to the poor. Now, I know it's hard to imagine that a person could be this crooked, but apparently he just wanted the money in the coffer so he was stealing it for himself. But what he was basically saying is, what a waste of money. Jesus says, no, she's done a beautiful thing. And beautiful things help change the world. So thanks for that question. We have one more question right up here. And this will probably be our last for the night. So thanks. We'll be with you in just a second here. If there's one more, we could maybe take it. But okay, this will be our last one. Yes,
Let's see
go
if
ahead.
this mic is working. It is. Hi, I'm Wendy.
Hi, Wendy.
It's great to meet you. Thank you for this. For those of us who are interested in being part of hopefully avoiding that collapse and doing our work and might have a platform that takes courage to do this type of work, but yet, as you highlighted, the dominance and the violent ways seem to be increasing.
Yes.
How do you find courage?
Yes.
You know, speaking about visiting Virginia and that calling, man, it just feels so easy sometimes to just want to stop doing the work because it's just becoming more and more scary. And we live in an area where yoga gets put into schools or meditation programs or, you know, LGBTQT plus programs, and people get death threats.
Yeah.
Like right here in Encinitas in Carlsbad, PTA members.
Yeah.
And I've just seen it so intensely in my platform. The attack is hard.
Yes.
So how do you keep doing that work? How do you find courage? And what words would you say there
Yeah.
for those of us who have a deep passion and a drive
Yeah.
to hopefully
Thank
avoid
you,
the
Wendy.
collapse?
Gosh, do you all hear it in every one of the questions? Just this beautiful heart. Like, I know it's going to take courage. That's not going to stop me. How do I have the courage? I mean, what a great question, Wendy. Like, once you know it's going to take courage, you won't be surprised when there's blowback. I began, you know, in the early 2000s, Pastor Mark mentioned that I'd written a book that was helpful to him. A lot of other people didn't like my books so much. And I was just telling somebody this story the other day. I was in Norway. I was asked to speak in Norway and Sweden and Denmark. And I was in Norway, and I was in one of the larger cities in Norway called Stavanger. And when I got there, it's a small enough town that when somebody comes from out of town to give a lecture, they send a journalist. So the journalist came to interview me, and he was a non-religious person. He'd never heard of me, like 8 billion other people in the world. So he did research on the internet, looked up my name on the internet, and he came with this file full of, he printed out all these websites. And he said, "I'm very nervous about this interview. It's the most nervous I've ever been about any interview." I said, "Oh, I hope I'm not intimidating. Why you're nervous?" He opens his file, he says, "Did you know you are the son of Satan?" So, and he was being funny, but he'd found all these things. So there are a lot of people who I don't get a happy birthday card from. It'll be more like, when I die, it'll be like, oh, finally, he's gone. So, and I've been privileged in these years to know so many people who have courage. And I look at their example and I say, which club would I like to be part of? The club of people who have courage, or the club of people who are only concerned about, whatever. And what's so interesting to me in the Gospels, Jesus' very first major teaching that we get in the Gospel of Matthew is called the Sermon on the Mount. And he begins by like throwing down the gauntlet with this set of, depending on how you count them, 8 or 9 principles. Like, I personally think Christians should know more about the 8 or 9 fundamental principles Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount than they need to know about the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments are great, but the 8 principles of Jesus, and these principles are exactly what we're talking about tonight. Jesus is giving them indigenous, spiritual values as opposed to the values of the empire, the colonizing empires of this world. First, he says, "Blessed are the poor." Now, he's not saying the poor are well off. He's saying, in this movement we're launching today, we begin, number one statement, we bless the poor. We think the poor matter. Poor lives matter. And you might not be able to imagine that making people angry. But you understand? He says, we bless the poor. The kingdom of God is theirs. They matter in this world. And then he says, blessed are they who mourn. Well, mourning is not just blessed are the sad. Mourning is what you do when somebody dies. Everybody in this world is saying, blessed are the killers because they win the wars. And he says, no, it's not the people who are happy about defeating others, it's the people who are mourning those who are killed. Do you understand? Everyone. Blessed are the meek, not the arrogant, not the dominating, not the violent. Blessed are the nonviolent and meek. So he's saying, we're creating a movement with a radically different set of values. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of justice. If you care about the poor, and you care about the meek, and you care about those who mourn, you will be persecuted. So he says, blessed are they who are persecuted against justice. The people who stand up for these people are blessed. It's a group of four. Next group. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers. They'll be called God's children. And then blessed are you when you're persecuted for justice. If you care about mercy, it's hard to imagine a world where someone would get in trouble for claiming that mercy is important. But it happens. If you stand up for those values, you'll be persecuted. And so, when you say kind of, how have I done this? I'm not a fighter by nature, but I realized when Jesus says, blessed are you, for so they persecuted the prophets. It's his way of saying, look, to be part of that club is to be part of a prophet's club that's in this world to do good. And if that's the group you want to be in, good for you. You know, that's what I'm doing, Jesus is saying. And so I think that's a good way for us to end this night, because in a way, we're all making the choice of which group we want to join. And there's great joy in that. I'll just tell you, I was thinking about this yesterday. When I was in the beginning of getting in trouble for some of these reasons, I was just a guy, I was a pastor who read the Bible. I had to read it because I had to preach it. And when I read it, I couldn't help but see these things. And so I talk about them, and then people get upset. And one of my mentors gave me this little handout. Do any of you remember Ditto paper? It was a Ditto thing. It was old. He'd had it in his file a long time. Gave it to me, and he said, I think this will help you. And it was a prayer written by a Serbian Orthodox bishop who had stood up to the Nazis in World War II. And he gave me this prayer, and he said, I think you're going to need this. It's called Prayer for Enemies. And I put that on my desk, and every couple days I'd read it and pray it. But I think this is our work. And the beautiful thing about it is we're not saying we're good guys and they're bad guys. We're saying everybody, we've all been controlled by the colonizer spirit. Get what you can get. Get revenge on anybody who gets in your way. Only count having more money than the next guy. And we've all been, and what a joy to say that way of life isn't working. I've become disillusioned with that way of life. I'm letting it go, and I'm looking for a new way of life, and I want to be part of that. And for everyone who that's what's going on in your heart, all I can say is what an honor to be able to be here tonight and maybe give you a little nudge of encouragement. God bless you. Thanks.